Helen, can I start with you? First of all, we've got Alan Joyce just in about 20 minutes' time. He's going to appear in front of a Senate committee, and I'm sure they're all lining up their questions to ask him. What particular questions would you like to hear him asked this morning?
Well, it's obviously going to be, I think, from the Coalition's perspective, very interesting to hear from him what would have been his reaction had the government taken the step of terminating, actually by ministerial direction, actually terminating the dispute. They have got power to do that. They decided they wouldn't do it. My understanding is that Alan Joyce said that Qantas would not have disputed that if the government had, by way of ministerial direction, simply said that the action should stop, the industrial action should stop. That would have meant that there wouldn't have been the 2 days of turmoil while it went to Fair Work Australia. That would be a line of questioning that I think would be very interesting to pursue.
Helen Coonan, you'd be focusing on hypotheticals rather than what actually did happen?
Well, I think what we really have to understand here is what in fact happened, which was that the government did have the capacity to actually act more quickly when they had notice on the Saturday at 2 o'clock. Had they joined the dots earlier on and known that this was coming, which seemed almost inevitable, it was like a tsunami coming, coming on shore and not moving people to safe ground. Instead, the government was very flat-footed and waited until the airline was grounded and then reacted by sending it to Fair Work Australia. So I think it's very important to understand that this was available, and the Prime Minister said, if I recall what she said correctly, that because this hadn't been tested, the government was reluctant to use it, and because they thought that it would be disputed, they were reluctant to use it. Well, what's it doing in the Act, and why would you actually have this fail-safe provision when you know that the whole country's going to be brought to a halt by action that was about to be taken?
Duncan Kerr, it's fair to say government ministers are absolutely furious about Qantas's actions in grounding their fleet. What's your take on how the government handled this crisis?
Well, I actually think it probably has been a pretty good week for the government, because it acted very promptly when it was faced with this potential catastrophe for Australia's national reputation, with an airline bringing its fleet to the ground. I think, we can all look back and say things might be done differently, and I suspect that the trade union movement might be looking at the way in which those series of stoppages that impacted on Qantas over time led to a consequence where Joyce basically bet the company, bet that he could bring about a consequence where industrial action would be stopped, and in a sense, although he is suffering enormous anger across the Australian community, it may be that he has used the industrial laws to Qantas's advantage. So the legislation that Helen mentions was in the Act under the former government. It wasn't used before. The government acted promptly when it faced this crisis, and it got the planes back in the air fast. I just hope that it does mean now that the unions and the company recognise that a protracted fight between management and those who work and who provide this customer support, who need to be engaged with a high morale airline, we can come together, because this is not the end of this. This is a starting point for a new rebuilding. And if that rebuilding leaves Qantas in a vulnerable position, there have been many airlines that have gone out of business, and there's no magic in this world of competition that protects Qantas anymore.
Duncan Kerr, you're critical there, just briefly, Duncan Kerr, critical of the unions there, but do you believe they've been given, as critics would suggest, far too much scope of the Fair Work Act? The critics have suggested unions have been able to exploit the Fair Work Act by being able to stage these often protracted industrial disputes where companies, Qantas obviously being the key example here, have been left with no choice but to take very strong action.
Michael, can I say, look, I'm not critical of the unions. I think this is a clash that is fully understandable. I mean, if I was a worker in Qantas and facing the kind of circumstances, the workforce in Qantas has grown up in an industrial environment where people have expected, and I think rightly expected, to be well paid, to have secure positions, and to work in an airline that is of world standard. But on the other side of the equation is the fact that the competitive environment is changing very rapidly, and these two things have come together. I don't criticise the unions at all for what they're doing. I'm just saying that if you look in retrospect, people might make different judgments, but retrospect is one of those terrible things that we can all have 20/20 vision. I'm not critical of the unions at all. They were doing their job to protect their workers' interests as best they could. The point is that they were then confronted by management that escalated this dispute to a degree that was unprecedented. They bet the company. It may be that although Qantas suffered this enormous anger and public humiliation as a result of this, that in the long run this now sets up a framework where the management and the unions can get together and work out a common position that puts their interests together, because that's the future.
All right.
I think Duncan makes a... Can I just say, I think Duncan makes some very good points here, because the bigger issue here, the big confrontation is really how do you modernise, how do you restructure an airline that's trying to compete globally, that's bleeding internationally, and also adjust to the structural changes of what you do with a workforce in those circumstances. Now, you know, there are very real issues facing, if you like, both sides, but there's no doubt that if Australians more broadly, we all like and want Qantas to do well, if we're really serious about this, we've got to let management manage, but that's not to say that you don't have to also understand that there's some very long-term challenges to a workforce, as Duncan points out quite correctly, that have grown up in a very different industrial environment. And if you look at competing airlines such as Virgin and other cheaper airlines, their workforce is on very different conditions. So this has really got some distance to go, I think, to play out. There's some very big issues, but at the heart of it is what shape Qantas will be in at the end of this.
Look, it's a good point that you raise, Helen Coonan, and it brings up something, another news item, if you like, that came to the fore just in the last 24 hours. And it's parallel. And they're issues that in both your different governments you had to confront and deal with too. And that's Holden perhaps bringing to the end the design of the Commodore here in Australia and what that might mean for the local workforce. All of these international companies, as you say, Helen Coonan, are trying to compete, but you've got workers here who believe they're entitled to, the future security of their jobs. Dealing with that and all the untold money that's been thrown at, say, the car industry, for example, Duncan Kerr, it's a huge challenge for any government, isn't it? That you don't want to be the one that presides over the demise of an icon like that, yet how much money can you chuck at it?
Well, look, this is not the first start of this process. I mean, the Keating government brought down protection in the car industry, but the Hawke government, through the Button Plan, was able to keep a strong manufacturing base in Australia. We've got to keep playing this out. We're in the high-tech end, we're not on the low-cost end, and it will continually throw up these kind of challenges. And somebody called capitalism creative destruction. And the point is that the pace of this is so fast that it is challenging so many of us. I mean, it's challenging the union movement, it's challenging governments. Look at Europe at the moment, look at the crisis that we're facing. I mean, if I was to be critical, and, I'm a retired politician, I can be critical easily, but I try not to be. The one thing I would be critical of the response of the opposition is to the government's pledge to extend a line of credit into the support for the European debt restructuring, because we are a global economy now. Our national population, I can't think of it, about 20-some million.
Sure.
There are cities in China that have that many people. So we are not a major player. We have to make our way in this world against a background where not everything works in our favour.
Duncan Kerr, I'm just going to leave it there, and very quickly, can I get a response from you, Helen Coonan, and move on to another subject before we let you go?
Yes, I'll make it really quickly. It's in the budget, the provision to fund the IMF. I think it goes up to $10 billion next year. The Prime Minister seemed to be alluding to doing more. Now, I think that was the area that caused some consternation, because obviously the money has to be borrowed to be actually put into the IMF. And I think the point that Joe Hockey was making, if I heard him correctly, was he didn't think that it was appropriate that Australia be making additional money available to be bailing out Greece when there were other countries in the Eurozone balking at doing it, and Greece itself is practically imploding over the kinds of restructuring they need to actually stay in the Eurozone. So there's some very big issues here, but we simply don't know what the Prime Minister had in mind, what the quantum was, and I think there were some very reasonable caveats put on our position by the opposition.
Duncan Kerr, I can't let you go and not ask about the question about who may be Labor's Prime Minister next year. Is this renewed bout of speculation, in your view this week, simply a News Limited conspiracy, or is there something to it?
Look, I was completely blindsided when the change occurred from Kevin to Julia Gillard. I was out having dinner with the Solicitor General of Australia that night, and I came back into Parliament House to discover this was on. So you asking somebody who was ignorant of the background and circumstances when it actually happened last time. Look, I'm well out of this. I've just come back from Papua New Guinea, where I've been about for a month in a case about the ouster of the Somare government and the constitutional issues involved in that. I know more about the constitutional crisis in Papua New Guinea than I know about speculation.
But you've worked with Kevin Rudd, and you're obviously in touch with a lot of your colleagues who are still working with him. Will they be willing to accept his return to the Lodge?
Look, I'm well out of politics, and those are issues that my colleagues will have to deal with. I'm on good terms with Kevin. I'm on good terms with Julia, and I'd like to remain that way.
All right, good to talk to you this morning. We'll leave it there. Helen Coonan and Duncan Kerr, thanks so much for joining us today.